Welcome back to J300. Today we're going to talk about photo ethics. We're going to talk about photojournalism ethics, to be more precise. And the entire argument of today's lecture is basically going to hover around what should photojournalists do, and the key word that we're going to use over and over and over today is going to be deception. So you're going to hear me say it probably more times than I should, but that's going to be the key word that we're going to be thinking about is when are photojournalists deceptive, and when are they being truthful and honest as they should be. So obviously deceptive photos are all around us. This is going to be kind of a tour through our most recent presidential elections through deceptive photos. Obviously this is Barack Obama on the left and Sarah Palin on the right, but obviously it's not actually them. This is a Photoshop image of them supposedly as dancers in Dancing with the Stars, and this is a viral photo that went out of then vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin, who was running for president alongside John McCain, and this photo went viral and it was totally fake. That's not her on the left. The original photo is there on the right, and no one has been immune from this, whether it is Hillary Clinton in 2016 and this photo illustration of her with all kinds of odd symbology happening around her, or if it is President Trump more recently. And these kind of photos don't just happen in presidential politics, they also happen in entertainment. So this was a few years ago. This was Jay Leno on the right and Jimmy Fallon on the left. And as he was taking over the Tonight Show, the NBC studios produced this photo that they were using as a publicity shot. And so this is obviously a fake photo. They have Jay Leno on a motorcycle and the sidecar with Jimmy Fallon, but we should obviously understand that they're on a soundstage in Hollywood, and it's not actually happening, right? They're not actually out on a desert highway making this photo happen. So that should be enough, we would think, right? That should be a staged enough photo. But when the Daily News of New York got a hold of this photo, they decided, it's not quite campy enough, it's not quite staged enough, and so they went ahead and piled a bunch of cash into the sidecar that Jimmy Fallon is riding in there. So the question is, should the Daily News be using this photo at all, the publicity shot that was given to them by NBC? And then secondly, should they, if they're going to use a staged photo, should they be piling a bunch of money into the sidecar and having it fly out of the sidecar as well? Is this deceptive, or is in this some ways honest? This has happened in even more recent times, right? This is a photo from the fall of 2019, and we have this photo that President Trump tweeted out. The tweet is, "We have declassified a picture of the wonderful dog, name not declassified, that did such a great job in capturing and killing the leader of ISIS, Bakr al-Baghdadi." And so when al-Baghdadi was killed, this dog was a hero in some ways for tracking him down and cornering him. And so they released this photo of the dog. And when they did, they also released this photo a couple of days later. And this is a photo, again, from Donald Trump's Twitter feed. And if the photos look remarkably similar, it's because they are, right? It's the same image of the dog with the tongue hanging out the same side of his mouth, right? And this time he is having that exact same pose, but in a different place. Now he is being awarded this medal, and Trump is tweeting out the image. Where did this image come from? Where do we have the photo in the first place of Trump bestowing this medal? Well, it came from this photo. President Donald Trump bestows the nation's highest military honor, the Medal of Honor, to retired Army medic James McLaughlin during a ceremony in the East Room of the White House. July 31st, 2017 in Washington. It's an AP photo, it was an Associated Press photo, and the public relations arm of the White House and the president, they went ahead and combined the photo of the Army medic and the original photo of our dog here, and we get the photo in the middle. And so the question is, what should we be doing in these sort of situations? We have all kinds of entertainers and politicians using photos in different ways. We have people making memes for the internet in all of these different ways. And the question is, what should we as journalists be doing in these situations? I think we can look backward at those photos, whether they are of Obama or Palin or Clinton or Trump, and say a lot of those uses are not journalistic. They're not journalistic in any way. They should be we should be much more responsible as journalists, and some of those situations should be really obvious to us. But some of the situations I'm about to show you, when I present them in a class that's in person, the students are very divided, and we have lots and lots of discussions about what should happen in these particular journalistic situations. So I'm not going to be able to kind of engage you in the same way in this discussion, but I'm going to ask you the same questions that I would ask if we were in front of you, and that is, how should journalists handle these situations? What should they do in these particular situations? So I'll show you a couple different images, and I'll ask what your take is on them. So this is a photo of the Kent State protest that happened in the 1960s. This photo won a Pulitzer Prize for photography, and there is something in this photo that has been removed. And if you look closely with your kind of digital eye, you might be able to spot the place in the photo that has been manipulated. If you know the photo well enough, you might actually be able to spot the image or the part of the image that has been removed. So give it a scan. Can you see if you can tell what has been removed? And if you look closely above the woman's head in the middle of the photo, again, this woman is hovering over the top of the body of a fellow student who was killed during these riots, who was shot by the National Guard. What has been removed? Well, what has been removed is a stake that was coming out of the ground behind her head. And when this photo was rerun years and years later, the Time magazine decided that they would go ahead and remove that stake. So the question is it ethical to remove that object, or should we be okay with it? I think we can look at that photo and see why the photojournalist removed it, but the question is, should they have removed it? All right, so that's question number one. Question number two is it ethical to move an object? We're removing an object, that stake from the previous one. Is it okay for us to take this soccer ball, which is hovering in the air above this player's head, and go ahead and move it here so that we have a more a more interesting shot? We have a shot that has more impact to it, no pun intended. Is it okay for us to do that? So get that idea in your head. Is it okay for them to do that? Next one here is a photo from a high school yearbook that we received, and what would you think about taking this photo and instead displaying it in your publication, on your page, on your website in this way? Is it okay to flip a photo in this way? And think about why or why not you would be okay with that. What about this one here? What about the idea of taking a photo? This is O.J. Simpson after he was tracked down and chased in a low-speed chase through L.A. after the suspected murder of his ex-wife and his ex-wife's lover. What happened to this photo on the right? Well, the photo on the right was darkened for use in Time magazine. Is it okay for journalists to do that? Is it ethical for a journalist to do that? What about cropping a photo? If we want to go ahead and take this photo and we want to go ahead and remove the edges of that photo, we want to get rid of the post that's on the right-hand side of the photo. We want to get rid of some of the extra space that's on the left-hand side of the photo. Is that an okay photojournalistic thing to do? Is that ethical? What do you think about cropping photos, and where should that start and stop? Is it okay, for instance, to go ahead and make a huge crop to a photo? So instead of just cropping a small bit of the photo, which we did in the previous one, what if we made a really, really drastic crop to the photo? What if we made a crop that eliminated so much, including the line judge on the left-hand side, number 19 in the middle of the frame? What if we got rid of all of that stuff? How do you feel about that kind of crop? Is it ethical to do that? What about this photo? I took this photo and I mess up the exposure. It is very, very drastically underexposed. The photo is it's kind of a mess for that reason. It's hard to read what's happening in this jewelry making shop. So is it okay for me to go ahead and lighten the photo so that I can see more detail in the photo? And where should we stop the lightening? Could we lighten it even more than that? What about this idea of creating a photo illustration? This is the idea of creating a photo that, you know, is not representing real life, but illustrates some sort of idea inside of real life. Is it okay for us to not only create them, but to display them in our publications? What about a posed portrait? Should we be okay about posing a portrait and saying, excuse me, can you go ahead and look right here at the photo? Or is that some sort of a breach of photojournalistic ethics? Well, I think to figure out the answer to most of these questions, to come up with good answers, I think we should look to the professionals, right? We should look to what happens in professional circles when photojournalism takes place. So, the statement that we're going to look at here, the thing that we're going to use as our guiding principle, is the NPPA's statement. So this is probably one of the first things for this whole lecture that you're going to write down, because it's all been kind of a preamble to this point. And the NPPA is this. For your notes, you should have in there that it is the National Press Photographers Association, the NPPA. The National Press Photographers Association is the most official organization of news photographers in the nation, and they gather together and have contests, but they also come up with what is widely considered to be the most wide-ranging and accepted statement on photojournalism ethics. And so they say, as journalists, we believe the guiding principle of our profession is accuracy. Therefore, we believe it is wrong to alter the content of a photograph in any way that deceives the public. Now, I've added the underline and the boldness there, and I think you'll understand why in a second here. We also can look to the professionals at the World Press Photo Contest, and they have a whole series of videos that you could click through to in the slides for this lecture that say that they have videos that explain what they consider to be manipulation and what they consider to be the kind of manipulation that would exclude an entry from being able to be considered in its contest. So these are the two words that we can kind of hone in on, right? Manipulation. But I think even more than that, I want to focus your attention on this word deception, right? So I think that there are two things that we should think about when we are thinking about photojournalism ethics. And one is that we should not deceive a reasonable reader. What do I mean by that? I mean that if we are thinking about a media literate person in the world and they look at a photo and they think this thing is happening, thing A is happening, when in reality thing B is happening, that is a deception, right? Now, we're not talking about, young children who don't understand all of the principles of photography and media. We're not talking about somebody who has some sort of cognitive problem that they don't understand how to process photos, right? We're talking about reasonable readers. If we're talking about reasonable readers, we don't want to deceive them. And I think we're going to see lots of instances in this lecture of reasonable readers being very, very deceived, right? The number two thing that we want to realize is that in this media moment right here, we are being attacked as journalists, right? We are being doubted, we are being we're being slandered, we're being accused of being biased, and that we need to fight for that kind of credibility. And some of these some of these slanders on us are just that. They are slanders. They're meant to bring media and journalism down lower and make it not be trusted. We see this from the President of the United States. We see this from media outlets on the left and the right. We see all kinds of doubt in media. But part of that doubt in media is earned by some of the mistakes that you'll see in this lecture, where people are making mistakes. Now, the problem that we have with that is obviously that we are deceiving the reader. But the second kind of trickle-down effect of that is that when people have doubt in what they see in our images, they start to doubt what I put on this slide. They start to doubt every fact and every story and every headline. And that kind of credibility gap that we create, it bleeds into every other piece of journalism, so that the reader doesn't feel like they can trust what they're seeing. So deception in photographs, as the bottom of the slide says here, is still deception. We are deceiving people through what we are putting out in the world. So let's get into the case studies here, right? Let's talk about these individual instances and what photojournalism ethics would have to say about them. So the removal of this stake from behind this woman's head, I think that we can see the obvious motivation in doing that, right? That stake is incredibly distracting. That post coming out of her head makes it look as though it actually is coming out of her head. That is the most important part of the photograph. Her face is the most important and wrenching part of the photograph. So why would we want to have a post coming out of her head? Well, it's true that we don't want to have it coming out of her head, but I also think that we can make a very strong ethical argument that we should not remove it. And one of the big reasons that we shouldn't remove it is that it is deceptive to remove it, right? Someone who is there on that day might remember that that post was there and say, why in the world was it removed, right? I also think that in 2020, we can think of all of the internet conspiracies that are out there, and we could think about how if this image was displayed in some publications and this image was displayed in other publications, how people would start to go down the slippery slope of conspiracy theories and say, I wonder why that was removed. What else was removed? What else has been doctored about this photograph? So the answer to the question of is it ethical for a photojournalist to remove an object is no. Photojournalists should not remove objects from photos, and the reason is because it's deceptive, and the other reason is because people won't trust what your publication has to say about it. The idea of moving an object, right? The idea that we should move an object for some reason. Many people would argue that if this moment happened right here, it's not much different to say that this moment happened right here either. And I would call that a terrible argument. I would say that this moment right here did happen, and this moment didn't happen, right? Despite the fact that this is a terrible job of photoshopping, right? The shadows and everything else are poorly done here. The idea that this happened is false, right? Most soccer players, when they are at the moment of heading the ball, they do go ahead and close their eyes. When she's at this moment, the ball would actually be starting to be concave and wrap around her head, right? So this moment didn't happen. It is deceptive at its core to move that ball, and if someone were to see the digital noise, if you look up there where the ball was, you can start to see kind of the halo effect of that ball on the trees behind it. They are going to trust your publication less. It is not only deceptive, but it creates a feeling of distrust in our readers. What about this one? Why in the first place would I want to flip one of these photos? Well, lots of publication designers would say that you want to have someone, quote, looking into the copy on your page. So let's imagine that this photo is on the left side of the page. And if it's on the left side of the page, the copy might be on the right side of the page. Well, in this case, the woman would then be looking into the copy on the right-hand side. Well, that would be great. But what happens if we want to have the copy on the left-hand side of the page? If that's the case, then we're going to want her on the right side of the picture looking to the left. So is that a good enough reason to flip the photo? And the answer is no. This is an unethical use of Photoshop and of page design. We do not want to flip this photo. Now, this photo makes it completely clear why we don't want to do it, because her visor goes from readable lifeguard to completely irreadable and very, very awkward use of the word lifeguard. And I think that we should know that people have birthmarks and their faces are configured in particular ways, and so her face does not look like this. In real life, she has that mole on her cheek on the left-hand side of her face and not on the right-hand side of her face. If you know this pool in Overland Park, then you know that the concession stand is not on the left-hand side of the building, it is on the right-hand side of the building, and so we need to represent it there as well. Same deal, but different question with this one, right? Why are we tempted to go ahead and add the darkening to this photo? Well, I think that we can very easily make the argument that Time magazine was trying to do a couple things. First of all, it was trying to sell more magazines, right? There was a belief probably from the people at Time that by creating this photo on the right-hand side, by darkening it in this way, that they would make a more dramatic cover, that they would go ahead and sell more magazines. That's one of the big purposes of the cover of a magazine, is to sell more of those magazines. Why else would they do it? Well, I think it's very easy to make the argument that this plays into a racial stereotype, right? That the darker a person is, the more sinister they are, the more guilty they are, the more likely they are to have committed the crime here. So you see in this photo not just the mugshot and the skin tone of O.J. Simpson being darkened, but you can see in the background as well they have this vignetting effect where they are making that dark as well. The truth is that Newsweek used the photo much more true to how it was captured by the police photographer, and on the right-hand side, Time magazine darkened this image. Many, many people, and I would agree with them, say that this is a deceptive use of Photoshop, right? That we are manipulating this photo and that we are deceiving the public. So should we be unrealistically darkening this photo? The answer is no. The next example here is perhaps one of the strongest that we have to show, because we can trace it all the way from the beginning of its process all the way to the end of its process. So what you're looking at here is an altered photograph, in the same way that you've been looking at altered photographs earlier in this lecture. But this one is particularly interesting because we can kind of play a bit of detective with it. So this photo right here has a dead giveaway that it has been manipulated. There is something within it that is not just suspect, but is a dead giveaway that the photo has been manipulated and is deceptive. Now, many of you are looking at it right now and trying to find that piece of manipulation, right? That thing that is manipulated. And many students go ahead and look around the edges of this gentleman right here, and they see that digital noise that's happening there. I think that's a very smart place to look, and you can look into the clouds right here and you can see digital noise. But I'll give you a clue as to the who done it here and how they done it, and that is that there is something in the frame here that is repeated. There's something that doesn't just happen once, but actually happens twice in the photograph. And can you spot that thing that is repeated in the photograph? I'll give you a second to look at it. Some of you may have eagle eyes and have done a very good job of seeing that there is a did giveaway in this image, that down in the bottom left-hand corner of the image, we have these things being repeated, right? We have the man's knee on the left-hand side here being repeated again on the right-hand side of the soldier's knee. We see this gentleman right here being repeated over here on this side of the photograph as well. This photograph was taken by a photographer named Brian Walsky, or this composite photograph, as we'll soon see, was taken by a photographer named Brian Walsky, and he was embedded during the conflict earlier in this century, and he was documenting some of the peacekeeping efforts that were happening. What he did is he did indeed combine two different photographs, and readers were able to spot this repeated stuff that was happening in the bottom left-hand part of the photograph. He had taken one photograph, the photograph on the left, and another photograph, the photograph on the right, and he had put them together. Now, we could ask ourselves, why in the world was he tempted to do this? What was the temptation? What did he get from combining photo A and photo B? And what students often tell me that they see in the temptation here is that the photo on the left is a strong photo and the photo on the right is a strong photo, but they're much stronger when put together, right? That this photo on the left-hand side, the soldier is looking off the frame, and this gentleman in the middle is also looking off the frame, and perhaps they're looking at these people over here, or perhaps they're actually looking farther back. It's hard to tell, right? Same thing is true in this photograph. The soldier's gaze seems to be looking to the left here, perhaps at whatever machinery is coming through on the left-hand side of the frame here. But this gentleman right here seems to be addressing him. But the photo up at the top seems to put these two pieces together, right? We seem to have some movement over here on the right side of the frame, and we seem to have an interaction between that movement on the right-hand side of the frame and some urgency from the soldier over there. So that seems to be Walsky's temptation, right? If that's his temptation, and this is the final image that he came up with, what do we think about that ethically? Do we think that it is okay for him to have done this particular piece of manipulation? Well, I would argue, and most photojournalists would agree with me, that this is a totally unethical way of treating these two images. That when these images appeared on the Hartford Courant's front page, that the photojournalist and his editors and the publications were deceiving us as the public. Now, the truth that came out about this is that Walsky had contributed this photo from overseas, and when he had contributed overseas, he hadn't told anybody that he had composited these two photos, that he had put them together. And so the editors at the LA Times and the LA Times Bureau Service, they had no idea that they were distributing a photo that was going to be used throughout the nation in a deceptive way. And so in the Hartford Courant the next morning, this photo ran as large as this photo could run across a newspaper page, and one of the readers spotted it and contacted the Hartford Courant. Hartford Courant contacted the LA Times News Service, and when they made that discovery, they realized what Walsky had done. So what was Walsky's punishment? What happened to Walsky after this? The answer is that Walsky was fired. He was brought back from his assignment overseas. He was stripped of all of his camera gear. He was stripped of his company car. He was fired from his job, and he never received another job in photojournalism again. He went on to become a wedding photographer, right? He was never trusted to be a photojournalist, and this deception was part of, it was why he lost that job. So I think that we as journalists should take that lesson very strongly and realize that when this kind of manipulation happens in a photojournalistic setting, that people lose their jobs, and that our readers, in this case many readers, who had to read a correction the next day, they lose trust in who we are as journalists. So we should certainly avoid doing things like this. I'm going to leave this link in your slides here. This is another place where you can find more of these kind of altered images, and if you're interested in kind of going down the rabbit hole of some more of these altered images, you can find them there. This is another very famous instance, this time from Newsweek magazine. Is it okay for us to go ahead and do this? This is Martha Stewart, and she was just being released from prison after a conviction for insider trading. And so what do we make of this photograph? Well, generally, prisons don't allow photojournalists to come in and pose their inmates in, very fashionable, outfits and behind velvet curtains. So how did Newsweek get this photograph? How did they make it happen? Well, the answer is that they went ahead and they took a model and they had that model pose in this particular way. And then they went ahead and added Martha Stewart's body onto the top of this model. Is this an ethical way for us to handle this? And photojournalists would say no to this. But why did Newsweek do it? Well, Newsweek defended what it did here, and they said that if you go ahead and open up Newsweek and you looked on page 3, at the very bottom it said photo illustration by Newsweek magazine. And they, the managing editor of the publication, went on the media and said, I defend what we did here, and I think it's okay because we told the readers what we were doing. I would say that that's not right, that you need to be much more transparent about the photo work that you're doing in this way. When you're photoshopping someone in this way, you should be much more transparent about it, right? This is a very interesting argument that's been happening within photojournalism recently, and that is the idea, is it okay to pose a news event? So the text on this page describes how President Obama, when Osama bin Laden was killed by U.S. forces, he went on television and he made that announcement. So while he was making that announcement, the television cameras were recording what he was saying, and photojournalists were standing outside the room, not able to take photos. Well, why weren't they allowed to take photos? The White House believed at the time that it would be very distracting if Barack Obama was making this announcement while cameras were clicking in the background. And so what they did is they posed the news event again afterwards and said that President Obama was making the announcement. So if you picked up the Kansas City Star the next day, you would have seen a picture of President Obama speaking, but it wouldn't have been him speaking to the television cameras. It would have been him recreating the speech. And so what you see here is that this was the end of this practice for many publications. They said, enough of that. If you're going to go ahead and ask us to pose as though the news event is happening, then we want to actually see it happen. We don't want you to recreate it after the television cameras have stopped rolling. So that's an interesting ethical argument that's happening within photojournalism. That is not a starkly ethical or unethical thing that we could say is happening. So what about this one? What about the idea of is it ethical to crop a photo? Well, we said before that we shouldn't remove anything from a photo. Well, this is a photo on a college campus, much the same way as our Kent State protester photo was a photo on a college campus as well. And what we're going to remove from this photo is also a post. We're going to remove the post at the edge of this photo. So using that same principle of photojournalism ethics, you could assume that this is unethical, right? We're removing something from a photo. So why is it not ethical to remove the post that's in the middle of the frame, and it is ethical to remove and crop this photo? So let's state it very clearly here. It is ethical to crop photos. It is ethical to remove this this post from the right-hand side of the photo. Why is that? What we would say as photojournalists is that anytime that you're pointing your camera in a particular direction, you're making choices about what is in the photo and what's out of the photo, and that the reader understands that choice. They understand that there was more to the photo that's not being shown there. What they don't understand is when something from the middle of a photo is removed. So is it ethical to make crops like this? Yes, it's totally ethical to make crops like this. What about huge, aggressive crops like this, where we're going to go ahead and remove a lot? Photojournalists would also say, yes, it's okay to remove large parts of photos as well, that people still understand that we are only seeing a select part of the frame. What about this, where we are lightening an image? And the answer is, it is okay to lighten an image in a way that represents how it looked in real life. The OJ example was the opposite, right? We were taking a photo and we were making it unrealistically dark, whereas this photo right here, we're making it realistic to what it looked like when I was there in that moment. So yes, it is ethical to lighten and darken photos, just so long as we are taking it to a realistic place, right? Is it ethical to make someone look more attractive? So this was a famous situation at the time. This was before fertility treatment was creating lots and lots of multiple births and septuplets and stuff like that. These were the amazing Macaulay septuplets, right? They were on the cover of Newsweek and Time, because she was giving birth to 7 children at a time. And on the left hand side, you see that Newsweek, you are in our lecture too often here, Newsweek has gone ahead and fixed the teeth of the mother, whereas Time magazine has left her as is. And the question is it okay for us to make someone look more attractive? Is it okay for us to Photoshop this woman's teeth? And a lot of people would say, I don't know. What would you say about it? Obviously, it is made much more complicated because not every publication is Time or Newsweek. Some publications are fashion magazines, right? Where we are going to go ahead and make people look more attractive, and we're going to go ahead and change the appearance of them, right? This is done in this case here in a small way. We don't have as many alterations being made here. Maybe we're making colors more vivid. Maybe we're smoothing out some skin blemishes, right? But if we look at images like this image from Redbook, we can see just how much we are willing to Photoshop images that are going to go on the covers of magazines. So go ahead and do a little scavenger hunt here and see how many things you can see that have been changed from the original image on the right-hand side to the eventual cover image on the left-hand side. Students have pointed out many things in the past. They've pointed out how this skin that is over top of her dress on the right-hand side has been eliminated on the left-hand side. They've pointed out that her collarbone that exists on the right-hand side is basically absent on the right-hand side. They've pointed out that she doesn't have a right arm. It's hidden in this frame on the right-hand side, but they've gone ahead and added a right arm. They've made her arm more skinny. They've eliminated the bags underneath her eyes. They've smoothed her skin. They've changed the color of her hair, right? And they've done so much to change what this photo looks like. How do we feel about this ethically, right? How do we feel about an image like this? This is the original image of Lena Dunham, the director and star of Girls from HBO. And that's Adam Driver, her co-star, and someone you might know as Kylo Ren more frequently, right? And so there's the original image of what the photographer shot. And then when it was represented in the magazine, it was represented in this way. So we have this image being changed to this image. We have the neckline of her dress being changed. We have the tint of the situation situation obviously being changed as well, but most we have the elimination of that neckline or the moving of that neckline. Perhaps more starkly, we can see in close-ups that we're going to see all kinds of movement and neckline and changing of the shape of her face as well, right? This is even more stark when we look at the cover image from Vogue that this was used in. And we can see this is the original image of Lena Dunham, so part of the same photo shoot that she did. And then we can see that she is changed to looking like this. So before and after, before and after. You can see that there are what people would call some design choices that are made. For instance, look underneath the letter S in spring style. There used to be a polka dot there. It has been eliminated. There have been a couple other polka dots that have been eliminated. Some of that is for the readability of that type, the legibility of that type, right? Why have we gone ahead and changed the her haircut, right? You can see that there are elements of her hair that have been changed here. So how do we feel about this, right? How do we feel about fashion images being changed? How do we feel about women, especially young women, being changed for the sake of cover images and selling more magazines? And I think that Lena Dunham, as a woman who speaks about feminist issues often, she has a really interesting take on this. Not one that some of you will disagree with, but here's what she said when she spoke to Slate magazine France about this. She said, "I understand that for people there's a contradiction between what I do and being on the cover of Vogue, but frankly I really don't know what the photoshopping situation is. I can't look at myself really objectively in that way. I know that I feel really like Vogue supported me and wanted to put a depiction of me on their cover. I never felt bullied into anything. I felt really happy because they dressed me and styled me in a way that really reflects who I am. And I felt that I was very lucky and that all the editors understood my persona, my creativity, and who I am. I haven't been keeping track of all the reactions, but I know some people have been really angry about the cover, and that confuses me a little. I don't understand why. Photoshop or no, having a woman who is different than the typical Vogue cover girl could be a bad thing." Her quote continues, "A fashion magazine is like a beautiful fantasy. Vogue isn't the place that we go to look at realistic women. Vogue is the place that we go to look at beautiful clothes and fancy places and escapism. And so I really feel like if the story reflects me and I happen to be wearing a beautiful Prada dress and surrounded by beautiful men and dogs, what's the problem? If they want to see what I really look like, go watch the show that I make every single week." And I think that in an odd way here, Dunham has gotten to a guiding principle about what should we do about people's appearance here, right? She says that she feels like Vogue is a beautiful fantasy, right? That it is meant to be that. And I would in a lot of ways agree with her that Vogue is not something that we trust to be realistic, right? So if we are going to allow people to change their appearance, if we're going to allow photographers to change the appearance of people, that this is a much safer place to change that appearance. It is not a very safe place to change that appearance when we're looking at magazines that are called Newsweek and our Time magazine. We look at those as photojournalistic outlets. Now, I would say that there's no reason to make these kind of adjustments to anyone's bodies, especially women's bodies, on the cover of magazines. But if it's going to happen, then it's probably a safer place to happen on fashion magazine covers. So don't mistake what I'm saying here. I'd rather it not happen anywhere. But photojournalism is probably not happening on the cover of Vogue magazine, whereas photojournalism is a much more strong term when we're talking about it on Time Magazine or Newsweek, right? So with that in mind, one of the most graphic ways that we create unreality is through a photo illustration. So what is a photo illustration, and is it ethical to create one? This is a really good example of a photo illustration, right? Nobody believes that there were 200 planes taking off at the same time at this airport. But this illustrates how many planes take off in a given amount of time at the airport. And it's visually interesting, right? It's much more visually interesting than just having one plane take off during that in an image. And so it's interesting to look at. Again, no reasonable reader would look at this and say, oh my gosh, look at all of those planes taking off at the same time. No reasonable reader would look at this image right here and say, oh my gosh, look at those 6 guys that are on that rail doing that snowboarding thing. Nobody would think that that's true either, right? That's not what a reasonable reader would be. So let's define the term. Let's define what a photo illustration is. So what is a photo illustration? This is what a photo illustration is in my book, right? A photo illustration is something that is obviously manipulated that any reader would recognize as a fake image. I bolded those words there of obviously manipulated because it's kind of a talent for photo illustrators that they are able to create something that people can look at and know, oh, well, that's obviously fake. That's part of what's going on here. What happens in photo illustrations often is that we will combine images. We saw that with the airplane image and the snowboarder image, right? Sometimes that they will add symbols and typography, and I'll give you some examples of that as well. Sometimes they'll use photo illustrations to illustrate a concept that would otherwise be really, really hard to illustrate. And I'll give you some examples of those as well. And then the final thing, I would go ahead and put like a big star next to this one. And it's the idea that we should label our photo illustrations as such and very close to where we're making the photo illustration. So the one of Martha Stewart that we saw earlier, it was labeled as a photo illustration, but not until 2 pages later. Let's do that really, really close to the photo illustration. Some other examples of photo illustrations would be like this, right? This baby that we went ahead and took many, many different pictures of. We did lots and lots of Photoshop work too. We had them stand up and we added grass and we made it look sinister and we changed everything about it. We obviously made this fake photograph happen through all kinds of manipulation, from taking a a series of photos that we couldn't make happen otherwise, and we put them all together, right? Anyone would recognize that as being fake, right? This is a great example of the kind of story that you might want to illustrate with a photo illustration. So let's say that you were given an assignment as a photographer. We want you to go take a picture for this story. Stress, seen and unseen, can have a profound effect on even the healthiest body. Well, that seems like a nearly impossible task, to take a bunch of photos that reveal that, but this photo illustration does that in an interesting way. A photo illustration for tomatoes being the signature food item at a state fair. Obviously, that's a fun way of playing with that. So photo illustrations, ethical, yes, when they are used in a particular way. So I would say yes, we can do them, we just need to treat them the correct way. That brings us to the idea of posed portraits, right? What should we do about those? We've talked about in photojournalism that photojournalism should be candid and should not be posed for the most part, that it should be honest. So is it ethical for us to pose a portrait? Is it ethical for us to ask the boxer Manny Pacquiao to sit in his corner and stare at us, and we're going to go ahead and set up lights that will make him look incredibly, incredibly daunting here, right? So how is a posed portrait different from a photo illustration in the first place? So the first thing is going to be kind of a long definition here. Sorry about this one. A portrait is an image that the reader would recognize as posed whereas the photo illustration is something that's been manipulated. So that's probably the most operative word there, is the idea of posing it, right? Posing that portrait. If we have someone looking at the camera, right, if they're kind of addressing the camera, and if we have them posing in such a way that makes it clear that the photo was arranged, and if we go ahead and manipulate the environment of that photo, then portraits can be incredibly storytelling, and they can be very useful in creating images of people, right? You might in the caption say that it's a posed photo. That might help your reader understand how that photo came about, but you wouldn't need to label that photo as a photo illustration in that case, right? You don't need to say that it's an illustration, because that would signify that you've manipulated that photo in kind of like a technological way, right? So let's see some more examples of posed portraits, right? This famous photo from National Geographic that addresses the camera, right? She's looking right at the camera. It's very obvious that she's aware of the camera and we're aware of her. So that is an okay way of posing a portrait? Yes, absolutely. It's okay for us to do that because people understand that we have posed it, right? Same thing with this photo, right? It's obvious that he sees the camera and that he's looking at the camera. And even photos like this are really helpful too. This is a photo of a woman in a religious order that doesn't believe in having your photograph taken, and so she's very nervous in front of the camera. You can, I think, have a problem with the ethics of photographing someone who's uncomfortable with being photographed, but the idea that she is being photographed and that we're taking a picture of her, I think that we can call it obvious that she knows that she's having her picture taken and that the audience knows that she's having her picture taken too. So many of you may think, well, this is all great for photojournalists, but I'm going into Stratcom, and so maybe I don't need to abide by any of these rules. But I think we have plenty of examples. This is the one I'm going to choose of how manipulating photos can blow up in your face as a strategic communicator too. So here's the first one, and it's a famous case. This is from the University of Wisconsin almost 20 years ago now, and this is a manipulated photograph. And let's just see if you can spot the manipulation of this photograph. There has been something that's been added to this photograph. What was added? Well, if you have a good photographic eye and you can spot manipulation pretty well, then you notice that on the left-hand side of the image here, that the gentleman's face over on the left-hand side has been added to the photograph. So why was it added in the first place? The reason it was added is because the admissions rep saw a proof of the application for undergraduate admission for this year, and he said, that looks like an incredibly white cover. We need to have some diversity on our cover for, application's sake. We need to represent some diversity in our cover. And so he sent his photographer back through the archives to try to find other photos. And the tragic thing was at the University of Wisconsin that there weren't any photos that they had that represented a diverse cross-section of University of Wisconsin. So instead of going and shooting more photos that could represent this, or better yet, actually changing the campus culture so that there's some diversity in the things that you photograph, right? Instead of doing either of those, they took this gentleman's face and photoshopped it onto this image. When they did this, they also made the mistake of this. The gentleman that was photoshopped on there was also the same person who appeared in the previous year's application on its cover, and he was added to be a person of color in that situation too. So obviously lots and lots of problems with this use of Photoshop. 60,000 applications had to be reprinted back in 2001 and 2002 from the University of Wisconsin. Lots and lots of negative media stories. So going from something that's supposed to be a positive image of your school and a strategic communication of your school to being something that blows up in your face and gets you terrible publicity. That's one of the reasons that strategic communication should avoid this kind of deceptive manipulation too, right? So let's return to our initial principles, right? If we ask the question, would a reasonable reader be deceived by the photo? And the answer is yes, then we should avoid doing whatever we're doing in that photojournalism ethics, right? We should avoid removing things from the photo. We should avoid photoshopping something to make it look more sinister or unreal. And then the second thing that we should think about is the idea that when we're deceiving, we are deceiving our readers and making them much more skeptical of journalism as a whole. So we should avoid those things, right? Because photojournalism deception bleeds out and taints how our readers think about photojournalism and journalism in general. That's it. That's all that I have in terms of photojournalism and its ethics for today. Our next lecture is coming soon, and we'll start getting you even more ready for our exam, which is coming next week. I will talk to you soon. Hope things are going well for you, and see you then.